The moment I noticed water pooling ominously near the edge of my driveway, I knew the HOA had struck again, and this time, their audacity reached a level that demanded more than polite emails and phone calls. It was early spring, the sun had barely climbed above the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the manicured lawns of the subdivision, and yet there I was, standing in my yard with mud squishing between my toes, staring at the deliberate blockage in the drain that had kept my property perfectly dry for years, a blockade orchestrated, no doubt, by Karen, the neighborhood's notorious self-appointed enforcer of rules, a woman so large in girth and ego that she seemed to take up the air itself whenever she barged into a conversation. And as my frustration mounted, I couldn't help but replay in my mind the countless petty disputes we had endured over the years, from lawn edging to mailbox colors, each escalating as her sense of entitlement grew. But this act of sabotage was beyond anything I could ignore, and while some neighbors might have meekly called the police or fumed silently, I had a different approach in mind, one that required patience, timing, and a precise understanding of hydraulics and drainage that most HOA Karen types could never even begin to comprehend. I spent the morning inspecting the culvert leading from my property to the communal drainage pipe, noting the subtle incline, the way the water should naturally flow, and then examining the obstruction, a crude barricade of bricks and garden debris, stacked haphazardly yet effectively enough to redirect an entire downpour right back onto my lawn. And as I crouched there, considering my options, I realized that simple removal would merely provoke her, a temporary fix that wouldn't deliver the satisfaction or justice her brazen sabotage deserved. So I began sketching out a plan, mentally measuring the volume of water I could redirect, calculating the pressure needed, and imagining the look on her face when the tables were turned, all the while hearing in my head the echoes of her shrill complaints from prior incidents, her threats thinly veiled as concern for community standards, and the absurdity of her standing in her pristine kitchen while I stood in muck and mud, plotting not revenge for the sake of malice but for the restoration of fairness and a little poetic justice. By noon, I had gathered the materials I would need: long hoses, a portable water pump, and a series of sandbags to channel the flow precisely where it needed to go, all innocuous items anyone could claim to be using for garden irrigation. Yet in my hands, they were instruments of inevitable karma, and as I loaded them into my truck, I could see her across the street, waddling slowly toward her driveway, hair perfectly coiffed, sunglasses reflecting the sunlight, completely unaware that her days of smug impunity were numbered, and my heart raced not just with excitement but with the thrill of executing a plan that was equal parts engineering and theatrics, the kind of spectacle that would leave the entire HOA gossip network buzzing for weeks, while reinforcing a simple principle. No one, not even Karen, could bully me on my own land without consequence, and as I returned to the blocked drain, I began setting up the diversion, laying hoses along the subtle slope of the yard, connecting the pump, and watching as water began to accumulate behind my improvised dam. Tension building with every rising inch, the mud sucking at my boots, the sun beating down, and the distant hum of sprinklers in the other yards forming a soundtrack to what would soon become a flood of both literal and figurative justice. And as the first jets of redirected water surged toward her property, I envisioned her horrified expression, her panicked attempts to salvage rugs and furniture, the frantic dialing of neighbors and the local HOA office, while I stood back, surveying the controlled chaos with a grim satisfaction, knowing that each liter cascading through the hoses represented not destruction for destruction's sake but a calculated, meticulous response to years of petty tyranny, the perfect blend of science, strategy, and satisfaction. And even as I felt a twinge of guilt for the audacity of my plan, I reminded myself that this was more than retaliation. It was a lesson in boundaries, in respect, in the realization that actions have consequences, and that sometimes to get a stubborn HOA to understand, you have to speak their language in terms of water, pressure, and a well-placed sense of inevitability. And by the time the first splashes reached her living room, seeping under doors and creeping across polished hardwood, I could hear her shrieks carrying across the quiet streets, mingling with the birdsong and the faint scent of freshly cut grass. And in that moment, standing soaked, muddy, and triumphant, I felt an exhilarating combination of relief, vindication, and adrenaline, knowing that Karen's reign of micromanagement and harassment had just been interrupted in a way she would never forget. The neighbors peeking cautiously from behind curtains, smartphones raised for evidence, their expressions ranging from disbelief to suppressed amusement. And as the water continued to pool in her lavish living room, soaking expensive rugs, furniture, and decorations that she had probably bragged about for years, I allowed myself a small, wry smile, acknowledging the absurdity, the brilliance, and the sheer theatricality of the situation, knowing full well that this would become legend in HOA circles. The story of how one determined homeowner turned the tables using nothing more than water, planning, and an understanding of natural flow dynamics. And as I began to slowly pack up my equipment, leaving just enough control to ensure her panic continued for hours, I reflected on the subtle, satisfying symmetry of it all. Years of her meddling, fines, and relentless policing of minor infractions culminated in a single, undeniable demonstration that power, when misused, invites creative reprisal, and that sometimes, the most effective way to restore order is to let the current run where it will, literally washing away the arrogance of someone who believed themselves untouchable. And as I finally stepped back onto my now sturdy, dry driveway, mud-streaked boots and all, I realized that this wasn't just a flood. It was a statement, a masterclass in consequences, and a reminder to the neighborhood that while HOA rules can regulate grass height and mailbox color, they cannot regulate justice when ingenuity, patience, and a bit of audacious strategy are applied with precision. And as the sun climbed higher, reflecting off the puddles now cascading in her living room, I could hear her muffled screams through closed doors, the frantic calls to her minions, the desperate banging at neighbors' doors, and I allowed myself a quiet chuckle, knowing this was only the beginning and that Karen and the HOA would never underestimate me again. Karen's shrieks echoed across the cul-de-sac like a siren warning of impending chaos, and as I watched from my driveway, strategically positioned to observe without being seen, I could see the full scope of her panic, the way her once impeccably styled hair now clung damply to her sweaty forehead, her oversized figure waddling frantically as she tried to corral the rising tide of water invading her pristine living room, the hardwood glistening under the assault, water creeping into every corner, the luxurious area rugs curling at the edges and darkening with moisture, and she screamed into her phone, likely calling the HOA office or perhaps her husband, though I doubted anyone could have calmed her at that point, and as the minutes stretched on, I saw the realization dawn on her face that this was not a simple pipe leak or a minor mishap. It was a calculated, deliberate act, a flood born of years of her petty harassment, her constant threats, her unrelenting imposition of rules and fines on my property for the most trivial reasons imaginable. And while some might have panicked further, bolting into panic mode, Karen was frozen momentarily, indecision etched in every panic gesture as she tried to figure out whether to salvage the furniture, stop the water, or call for backup, all the while slipping on the soaked floors, arms flailing wildly as water splashed across her silk blouse, now clinging to her body in a way that emphasized her considerable girth, her cries of frustration piercing the morning air like a banshee, and I couldn't help but feel a dark thrill at the spectacle, knowing that every second of this unfolding drama was both poetic and deserved, a karmic reversal of the countless times she had barged onto my property, lectured me about non-existent violations, and tried to micromanage my life in the name of HOA authority, and as the water rose, pooling around coffee tables, soaking couches and creeping up to the baseboards, I continued my own orchestration, adjusting hoses, repositioning sandbags, and even slightly opening my own floodgate valve to ensure that the flow maintained its momentum, the current now carrying small objects, flower pots, and decorative trinkets from her perfectly curated space out into the yard, creating an almost surreal tableau of chaos, the sunlight glinting off the floating debris and casting strange reflections across the street, drawing the attention of neighbors who began to peek out from behind. Curtains, smartphones in hand, some whispering in disbelief, others stifling laughter, and I felt the power of control in my hands, the ability to manipulate an environment with precision, turning the principles of hydraulics into instruments of poetic justice, while Karen, oblivious to the mechanics, was entirely at the mercy of the rising tide, slipping occasionally on the soaked floorboards, shouting in frustration, her voice echoing against the walls, carrying the scent of wet carpet and waterlogged furniture. And then came the realization that her electronics were now at risk, lamps and television sets teetering dangerously as the water lapped at cords, and I knew that her panic would only multiply, her sense of superiority shattered as she confronted the consequences of meddling in someone else's property, all while the neighbors watched with a mixture of shock and glee, their phones recording every second, the video soon to be shared in every HOA group chat, a cautionary tale of overreach. And in that moment I could see the human side of Karen, the fear, the helplessness, the sudden recognition that authority does not make one invincible, that arrogance has a price, and that water, like truth, always finds its level. And as the water continued to surge into her home, I thought back to the many times she had fined me for trivial violations, summoned me to meetings for imagined infractions, and called me in the middle of the night over the most absurd complaints. And now, every ounce of her indignation was being met with tangible, unavoidable consequences. the floorboards creaking under the weight of both water and the enormity of her mistakes, and I could see her trying to salvage what she could, lifting soaked cushions, grabbing expensive decorations, and shaking her fists at the sky as if the universe had conspired against her. But in reality, the only architect of this disaster was the years of disrespect and pettiness she had directed at me, and as I adjusted the hoses slightly to increase the flow, watching as the water surged through the living room, flooding hallways, seeping under doors, and creeping into adjacent rooms, I marveled at the precision of the operation, the way my planning and patience had turned ordinary items, hoses, pumps, sandbags, into instruments capable of exacting a lesson in humility, and the sound of splashing, dripping, and Karen's increasingly desperate shrieks blended into a chaotic symphony, punctuated by the occasional bang of furniture being shoved or knocked over, the slap of wet shoes against hardwood, and the muffled cries into her phone, which was now likely trying to summon help, while I remained outside, perfectly dry, surveying the scene like a general watching the culmination of a well-executed strategy, feeling the adrenaline surge in my veins, tempered by the satisfaction of knowing that this flood was not mere revenge, but an unavoidable consequence of hubris, the kind of lesson that could not be ignored or explained away. And as the water level rose further, touching her baseboards, flowing under the walls, and soaking more of her furniture, I imagined the chaos this would cause in her meticulously organized world, the panic, the frantic calls to plumbers, neighbors, and the HOA office, the insurance claims she would have to file, and most importantly, the realization that her sense of control over everyone else's lives was fragile, and when misused, completely reversible. And as I finally paused, stepping back to admire the fruits of patience, planning, and precise execution, I felt a surge of vindication, tempered by a sly amusement, knowing that Karen would remember this day, not as a minor inconvenience, not as a simple flood, but as the moment when her overreach collided spectacularly with someone unwilling to be bullied, and as the sun reflected off the rising tide in her living room, the neighbors' phones capturing every detail, and her muffled curses echoing across the street, I allowed myself a quiet, victorious smile, knowing that this was only the beginning of her lesson in humility, and that the story of how the HOA's most notorious enforcer was undone by water, planning, and a refusal to be intimidated would circulate in the neighborhood for months, if not years, as a testament to the power of patience, creativity, and standing one's ground. And as I finally turned to retreat to my own home, leaving just enough control to maintain the flooding's dramatic effect, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction, knowing that Karen would never again underestimate the consequences of meddling with someone who had both patience and cunning on their side, and that the echo of this day, the shouts, the splashes, the chaos, would resonate as a warning that authority, when abused, inevitably meets resistance in forms both clever and undeniable. By the time the afternoon sun reached its zenith, Karen had fully realized that her usual tactics of intimidation, complaints, and micromanagement were utterly useless against the force of water, planning, and sheer determination I had unleashed, and she now waddled frantically across her once pristine living room, slipping on the slick wooden floorboards, her oversized body creating waves as she lunged from one soaked rug to another, arms flailing wildly as if trying to physically push the water back, while shards of her luxurious furniture, upturned chairs, floating coffee tables, and half-saturated cushions, drifted like tiny ships in a rising, chaotic sea that reflected the sunlight streaming through her tall, immaculate windows. And every time she reached for something to save or secure, the water cunningly sloshed away, mocking her desperate attempts at control, while I, outside in my yard, strategically monitored the flow, adjusting hoses and sandbag placements with surgical precision, enjoying the thrill of watching her arrogance dissolve in real time. The neighbors now fully awake to the spectacle, peeking from behind blinds, raising their phones to capture every second, some whispering in disbelief, others laughing quietly as the infamous HOA queen became an unwilling star in her own personal catastrophe, and as the water level crept higher, I could see her frantic efforts escalate into pure panic, sloshing through rooms, cascading over the hallway threshold, and soaking every corner of her carefully curated home, the faint smell of wet upholstery and carpet mingling with the tang of waterlogged paper and electronics. And in her frenzy, Karen's cries alternated between shrill orders into her phone and pleading mutterings to herself, the sound punctuated by the occasional crash as furniture gave way under the relentless intrusion of water, her panic growing in direct proportion to the rising flood. And as I observed from my driveway, mud-streaked, boots firmly planted, I couldn't help but marvel at the theatricality of the scene, a surreal combination of natural forces, human folly, and precise planning, the perfect symphony of chaos that turned years of petty HOA tyranny into a visual, undeniable lesson. and I could see the subtle shift in her face as the realization sank in that this was not an accident, not a plumbing issue, but a deliberate response to years of harassment, the kind of lesson that no amount of shouting, pleading, or negotiation could reverse. And as the water surged through the living room, creeping into her kitchen and even the entryway, I allowed myself a quiet, victorious chuckle, knowing that each splash and each soaked piece of furniture symbolized not just revenge, but the broader principle that power, when misused, eventually meets creative, inevitable resistance. And Karen, who had spent so long lecturing others about rules and compliance, now understood firsthand the consequences of overreach, slipping and flailing with every futile effort to regain control, while I, still dry and confident, orchestrated the flow like a conductor guiding a symphony, the hoses and pumps acting as my instruments, and the water, guided by physics and patience, responding perfectly, each adjustment a tiny victory, each redirection a subtle lesson in humility. And as the minutes stretched into hours, Karen's frantic activity grew more erratic, her attempts at salvaging belongings resulting in further chaos, water spilling over furniture, cushions flipping and drifting across rooms, lamps toppling, small electronics short-circuiting, and the faint smell of damp chaos filling the air, all while I maintained precise control, ensuring maximum effect without causing structural damage, the perfect blend of theatrics and strategy. And I could see the mental shift in Karen as her panic became pure frustration, her screams no longer directed at any specific task but a primal recognition that she was utterly powerless. And the neighbors, emboldened by their secret observations, began murmuring to one another about the poetic justice unfolding, phones capturing videos that would soon spread across every local chat group, a cautionary tale of arrogance undone by strategy, patience, and a willingness to fight back. And as the water reached its peak, soaking carpets, furniture, and even creeping up under walls, I allowed myself a brief moment to reflect on the absurdity and brilliance of the operation, knowing that every drop represented both a literal and figurative reversal of fortune, years of petty fines, late-night calls, and intrusive inspections distilled into one perfect, unstoppable flood, while Karen, exhausted, soaked, and red-faced, finally slumped against a waterlogged wall, realizing that her authority, based solely on intimidation and self-perceived superiority, had no bearing here. And in that moment, the power dynamic shifted irreversibly, I outside in control. Dry and composed, observing the chaos I had created, a masterclass in patience, planning, and strategic retaliation, while Karen, now drenched and humiliated, could do nothing but shout, flail, and attempt small, futile corrections, the water mocking her every move, reflecting her distorted image in floating cushions and overturned chairs. And as the neighbors continued to watch in quiet awe, some snapping photos, others whispering warnings to one another about HOA overreach, I felt the surge of satisfaction, tempered by a subtle appreciation for the precision required to execute such an operation, the careful calculations of flow, pressure, and timing, each choice deliberate, ensuring the maximum dramatic effect without causing irreversible damage. And as the sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the street and illuminating the chaotic scene in golden light, I realized that Karen had now become a living lesson in humility, power, and the inevitability of consequences. And as the water finally began to slow under my subtle adjustments, pooling strategically to maintain her panic, I allowed myself a satisfied sigh, knowing that today justice had not only been served but had been executed with creativity, precision, and an unflinching commitment to reclaiming my space. And while some might call this extreme, I knew it was necessary, a calculated response to years of intrusion, harassment, and arrogance. And as I finally stepped back, surveying the full scope of the flood, from the now waterlogged living room to the chaotic hallway and kitchen, the neighbors' expressions a mixture of shock and suppressed amusement, and Karen's frantic, exhausted movements reduced to desperate flailing and shrill complaints, I felt a profound satisfaction, knowing that this moment, this flood, would be remembered in neighborhood lore for years to come, a cautionary tale that authority, when abused, always encounters resistance, and that sometimes water, patience, and precise planning speak louder than rules, fines, or threats ever could. By the time the first neighbors began emerging from their homes, cautiously peering over fences and out of windows, the full extent of Karen's living room flood had become undeniable, a chaotic tableau of waterlogged furniture, soaked carpets, floating cushions, and shattered decorative items, while she herself waddled frantically from room to room, her oversized frame glistening with sweat and water, hair plastered to her face, mouth open in a continuous stream of panicked shouting and incoherent curses, dialing her phone repeatedly and then hanging up in despair, the reality of the situation beginning to crush her haughty ego. and as she slammed doors and shoved furniture in vain attempts to block the rising tide, I stood outside, boots sunk in mud and soaked by the occasional spray from hoses I had deliberately mispositioned for maximum effect, savoring the carefully orchestrated chaos I had engineered over the course of hours, the satisfaction of seeing years of her relentless harassment, intrusive fines, and petty overreach finally meet a tangible, undeniable consequence, and the neighbors, now fully awake to the spectacle, whispered excitedly to one another, their smartphones raised, capturing video clips that would soon circulate like wildfire across social media and neighborhood groups, turning Karen's humiliation into a public, unforgettable lesson in hubris. And as I observed her frantic motions, it became clear that her panic had shifted from attempting to save material possessions to a desperate, almost comical effort to maintain a semblance of dignity, flailing arms, water dripping from her oversized clothes, the once pristine furniture now floating aimlessly or wedged against walls, lamps teetering dangerously as cords soaked through, and electronics already buzzing ominously from short circuits. And yet, even in the midst of this chaos, she refused to acknowledge the lesson in humility being delivered before her very eyes, stubbornly attempting to assert control over a situation that had long since outpaced her capacity to influence it, while I, outside, carefully monitored the flow, adjusting hoses and sandbags with the precision of a conductor managing an orchestra, ensuring the water's movement remained dramatic, visible, and utterly humiliating, every leader a perfect manifestation of strategy, patience, and poetic justice. And as I surveyed the scene, my mind briefly replayed the years of petty fines, late night HOA calls, unwarranted inspections, and incessant micromanaging, each memory reinforcing the righteousness of my actions, while Karen, oblivious to the lesson embedded in each ripple and splash, continued to stumble and flail, slipping on wet surfaces, drenched hair sticking to her round cheeks, her calls to the HOA office escalating in desperation, her voice shaking as she attempted to shift responsibility for her predicament, all the while the neighbors' whispers and stifled laughter grew, capturing the sense of absurdity, spectacle, and justice unfolding before them. And as I adjusted a valve slightly to redirect water toward her hallway and entryway, the cascading surge spread into adjacent rooms, soaking previously untouched rugs, furniture, and decorative items, creating a visual, almost cinematic display of chaos, while I remained outside, perfectly dry, boots caked in mud from earlier adjustments, surveying every effect, every splash, every expression of horror, knowing that every decision I made was reinforcing the inevitability of consequences for her arrogance. And as the minutes stretched into an hour, Karen's panic reached a fever pitch, her shouts blending with the splashing, the creaking of waterlogged furniture, and the occasional crash as a lamp or chair finally succumbed to the weight of water. While her frantic attempts to salvage her possessions only generated more chaos, the very objects she sought to save now propelled by the force of her own desperation, floating or tipping, smacking against walls, creating a cacophony of sound that amplified her distress. And as the neighbors began to record reactions for social media, some hiding behind hedges to avoid being seen, others cautiously stepping closer to witness the spectacle firsthand, I realized the power of my planning. Each element, from hose placement to water pressure, was carefully calculated to maximize effect without causing structural collapse, allowing the flood to serve as both a spectacle and a symbolic, precise lesson in humility and respect. And as Karen finally slumped in defeat against a soaked couch, her voice hoarse from screaming, dripping wet clothes clinging to her form, face red and eyes wide with disbelief, the full enormity of the situation finally sank in, the realization that her authority, her self-perceived invincibility, had evaporated as surely as her once pristine living room, and in that moment, I felt the perfect blend of satisfaction, amusement, and quiet vindication, knowing that this scene, her panic, the chaos, the spectators, and the undeniable evidence of her misjudgment, would be etched into neighborhood lore, a lesson in overreach, and the ultimate demonstration that one cannot bully, intimidate, or harass others without eventually facing consequences in ways both creative and unavoidable. And as I began to slowly pack up my hoses, leaving enough water flowing to maintain visual impact, I watched her stumble to the phone again, finally dialing friends, neighbors, and perhaps the insurance company, her voice shrill and frantic, recounting her version of events with increasingly implausible excuses, while I remained outside, surveying the dramatic aftermath. Water pooled across hallways, floating debris creating chaotic patterns, lamps and electronics partially submerged, rugs completely soaked, and the sun casting glinting reflections across the wet surfaces, turning the disaster into a theatrical display of comeuppance. And as Karen's exhausted, defeated posture became apparent, I allowed myself a satisfied smile, knowing this would be a moment remembered, recounted, and shared, the perfect counter to years of her petty tyranny. And as neighbors whispered, videos circulated, and Karen's panic continued in the background, I reflected on the ingenuity required to orchestrate such a precise, effective lesson, the careful balance of timing, flow, and impact each decision. Intentional, each splash a statement, a calculated reminder that authority misused inevitably encounters creative resistance. And as I finally turned to retreat into my own home, mud-caked boots heavy and water dripping from my clothes, I knew this day had transformed the neighborhood dynamic, teaching a lesson in humility, respect, and consequence, while simultaneously satisfying the long-held desire for justice, turning the simple act of redirected water into a narrative that would echo in HOA lore for years, a testament to patience, planning, and the undeniable power of calculated, theatrical revenge. As the floodwaters finally began to stabilize inside Karen's living room, she refused to accept defeat, her oversized frame heaving with frustration, hair plastered to her damp face, and cheeks flushed a deep red from a combination of exertion and embarrassment, her mind racing through every possible way to regain control of a situation that had spun wildly out of her grasp. Yet each idea seemed more ludicrous than the last, from calling emergency services to attempting to plug the hoses with towels or couch cushions, all while she continued to wade through ankle-deep water, flailing in a desperate ballet of fury and futility, and the neighbors, emboldened by the ongoing spectacle, now fully emerged from their homes, smartphones raised, capturing every ridiculous, chaotic, and utterly humiliating moment for posterity. The combination of dripping water, floating debris, overturned furniture, and Karen's shrill, panicked cries creating a scene so absurd and dramatic that it seemed almost cinematic in scale, with sunlight glinting off wet surfaces and casting distorted reflections of floating cushions and lamps across the walls. And as she staggered to the phone once again, dialing numbers in a frantic haze, I adjusted the hoses subtly, redirecting small currents toward her kitchen and entryway, ensuring the drama continued unabated, each liter of water a carefully measured instrument of humiliation, while Karen attempted in vain to corral the flow with mop heads, towels, and furniture, only to have the water slip around her, mocking every effort. And as she finally made a dash toward her sliding doors, trying to prevent the water from reaching the backyard, she slipped on the soaked hardwood, arms flailing, landing with a dramatic thud, sending more cushions, lamps, and papers floating in every direction. And I couldn't help but marvel at the sheer perfection of the chaos, the way years of her intrusive fines, incessant micromanaging, and relentless complaints had finally collided with an unstoppable force, both literal and metaphorical. And as she struggled to her feet, dripping wet and increasingly desperate, I noticed her gaze darting toward the neighbors, suddenly aware that her humiliation was no longer contained within the walls of her home but broadcast to an audience that had grown steadily as curiosity and amusement drew more people to their porches and lawns, whispers and suppressed laughter rippling through the crowd as phones recorded every flailing gesture, every shriek, every futile attempt to salvage belongings from the rising water, and I could feel a surge of triumph knowing that this spectacle would cement her reputation not as an intimidating authority figure, but as a cautionary tale of arrogance undone by strategy, patience, and audacity. And as Karen's frantic attempts escalated, she began pushing furniture against the doors, attempting to create a barrier, while simultaneously sloshing water onto herself, her silk blouse clinging, her oversized frame wobbling, yet the water simply flowed around, under, and past her, as if mocking her efforts, and I, outside in the relative safety and dryness of my own yard, adjusted a sandbag to divert a small stream toward her hallway, watching as the current surged with precision, flooding a previously untouched bedroom, sending papers, pillows, and a decorative vase floating like debris in a mini river, while Karen's face twisted into a mixture of horror and disbelief, realizing that every effort she made only intensified the chaos, that she had lost control entirely. And as the neighbors murmured among themselves, comparing notes, taking videos, and occasionally stifling laughter, I reflected on the ingenuity required to create this scenario. Careful planning, precise measurement of slopes, water pressure, and flow orchestrated to maximize impact without causing structural damage, turning ordinary hoses and sandbags into instruments of poetic justice. And as Karen continued to struggle, slipping and sliding, calling the HOA office, her voice rising to a near unbearable pitch, I could see the cognitive shift in her eyes, the dawning realization that her arrogance and relentless policing of others had directly led to her current predicament. And while some might have felt guilt or hesitation at the sheer absurdity of flooding another person's home, I felt only the satisfaction of a plan executed flawlessly, a tangible, undeniable lesson in humility, and as she stumbled toward her couch, now nearly submerged, attempting to save a prized throw pillow, her arms flailing in rhythm with the water's movement, I subtly redirected a small stream toward her entryway, ensuring the flood continued its dramatic progression, the chaos now reaching peak theatricality, furniture rocking and tilting, electronics buzzing ominously, and water dripping from ceiling light fixtures that had begun to accumulate condensation from the high humidity, while Karen's frantic cries, interspersed with incoherent muttering, carried across the street to the awed and entertained spectators, their whispers and snickers blending with the splashing water and the occasional crash of floating debris against walls, and I knew that this was exactly the intended effect. To teach a lesson in consequences, in respect, and in the realization that authority misused inevitably meets inventive, precise resistance. And as she lunged at another floating cushion, losing balance and falling face-first into the shallow water, sending ripples through the floating debris, I adjusted a valve slightly to increase pressure toward the hallway, flooding a room she had just begun attempting to dry with towels, while neighbors gasped and murmured in awe at the scale of the chaos, some daring to step closer to capture better footage, while others whispered warnings about HOA overreach and petty tyranny, and as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street, reflecting off the chaotic scene in golden light, Karen finally sank to the floor in sheer exhaustion, arms draped over her waterlogged furniture, hair plastered to her face streaked with water and sweat, breathing heavily, her oversized form slumping in a mixture of fatigue, frustration, and disbelief, realizing fully for the first time that her reign of petty control, threats, and fines had led her here. And as I carefully began to pack up my hoses, leaving just enough water flowing to maintain the visual spectacle, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that every action taken, every adjustment made, had contributed to a meticulously orchestrated display of poetic justice, turning a flood into a narrative of consequence, strategy, and unflinching reclamation of personal boundaries, while Karen, soaked, humiliated, and utterly defeated, could do nothing but flail, shout, and eventually slump into resigned despair, the entire neighborhood bearing witness to the collapse of her inflated sense of authority, and as the water slowly stabilized, pooling across every room, furniture floating or tilted, electronics buzzing or dead, and the neighbors still filming, whispering and laughing quietly, I allowed myself a moment to savor the culmination of hours of planning, preparation, and precise execution, knowing that this day would be remembered not just as a flood, but as a masterclass in ingenuity, patience, and the art of enforcing consequences, and that Karen, despite all her wealth, arrogance, and self-perceived dominance, would never again underestimate the power of someone willing to fight back with strategy, creativity, and unflinching determination. And as I finally retreated to my own yard, mud-caked boots heavy with the day's work, dripping water from hoses and sandbags, I realized that the neighborhood dynamic had shifted irreversibly, the lesson had been delivered in full, and the story of the HOA queen undone by her own overreach, clever planning, and the relentless flow of water would echo for years to come. By mid-afternoon, Karen had moved from frantic solo panic to desperate calls for backup, dialing every friend, relative, and neighbor she could think of, all the while flailing in ankle to knee-deep water that now covered her living room, entryway, and hallways, her oversized frame bobbing awkwardly as she tried to salvage her belongings, the once pristine hardwood floors now glistening with reflections of chaos, floating cushions and upturned furniture, dripping lamps and scattered papers. While outside, I maintained precise control of the flow from my yard, adjusting valves and hoses just enough to increase pressure toward the areas she had begun attempting to block, ensuring maximum effect without causing structural damage, and as the minutes stretched, the soundscape of the street transformed into a symphony of chaos. Karen's shrill, panicked voice echoing off houses, water slapping against furniture and walls, furniture creaking and toppling, electronics buzzing ominously, and the muffled whispers and stifled laughter of neighbors who had now fully emerged to witness the spectacle, smartphones raised, capturing every second for posterity, some daring to step closer to the edge of the chaos, while others stayed safely behind hedges and fences, their expressions a mixture of disbelief, amusement, and awe at the precision with which this drama unfolded. And Karen, oblivious to any of this observation, continued to flail, attempting to corral floating objects, mop up puddles, and push back water with towels and pieces of furniture, each effort creating further chaos, splashing herself, spilling water into previously dry rooms, and sending papers, cushions, and decorations tumbling unpredictably across the floor, while I, surveying the scene like a general overseeing a battlefield, silently marveled at the perfect balance of patience, planning, and precision that had led to this crescendo of inevitable consequences, recalling every petty fine, late night complaint, and overbearing intrusion she had inflicted upon me over the years, each memory fueling the meticulous orchestration of the flood. And as she finally managed to drag a soaked sofa toward the sliding doors in a desperate attempt to create a barrier, she slipped, sending the furniture crashing into the wall and splashing more water toward her hallway, while outside, I subtly adjusted a hose to redirect flow into her kitchen, sending a wave of water that swept papers, dishes, and small appliances across the already chaotic room. And as Karen's phone calls to the HOA office escalated into frantic, pleading explanations, the voice on the other end likely unable to offer meaningful assistance, I realized that the ripple effect of this flood extended far beyond her home, turning neighbors into witnesses, social media into an audience, and the entire HOA network into a lesson in humility, the sound of dripping water, crashing furniture, and shrieking echoing like a theatrical crescendo while Karen, now soaked to the skin, hair plastered to her round face streaked with water and sweat, screamed orders into the phone to no avail, attempting to regain control of a situation that had long since spiraled beyond her comprehension, and I, outside, methodically monitored the water's path, adjusting hoses and sandbags with precision, the water now surging through her dining area and into previously untouched hallways, sending floating debris across doorways, tipping chairs, and creating mini currents that amplified her panic, while neighbors whispered, gasped, and occasionally chuckled quietly, their phones capturing every ridiculous and humiliating moment, a perfect documentation of poetic justice unfolding in real time. And as the sun shifted, casting golden streaks through windows and illuminating the floating chaos in dramatic light, I reflected on the mastery of planning required to bring this moment to life. Calculations of flow, slope, and pressure, combined with patience, timing, and strategic foresight, turning ordinary hoses, sandbags, and valves into instruments capable of delivering both tangible results and psychological impact, while Karen, oblivious to these mechanics, continued to flail helplessly, attempting to salvage whatever she could, each movement generating more chaos and amplifying the spectacle, the water mocking her every effort as it flowed around barriers, under furniture, and into rooms she had hoped would remain dry. And as she finally sank to the floor in exhaustion, arms draped over a waterlogged chair, breathing heavily, the reality of the situation fully sinking in, I allowed myself a satisfied smile, knowing that the lesson had been internalized even if she refused to admit it. And as neighbors continued filming, whispering, and laughing quietly, I ensured that the flood maintained just enough movement to keep her panic alive. The hoses nudged slightly, valves adjusted with subtlety, and currents directed toward areas she had begun attempting to salvage, ensuring maximum humiliation. And as Karen's panic reached new heights, she began kicking at floating cushions, sliding across soaked rugs, and shouting incomprehensibly into her phone, calling in friends, relatives, and any nearby help she could muster. Yet none could stop the inevitable, the water now surging into the entryway, stairwell, and dining area, creating an almost cinematic display of chaos, the sunlight glinting off floating furniture, lamps, and scattered belongings, while I remained outside, dry and composed, observing the perfect orchestration of physics, strategy, and timing, knowing that every decision I made, every hose adjusted, and every valve shifted contributed to this crescendo of poetic justice. And as Karen finally realized that her attempts at salvaging anything were futile, sinking to her knees, hands clutching a soaked phone, hair dripping, oversized frames slumping in defeat, I felt a profound satisfaction, tempered by a sly amusement at the theatricality of the scene, a combination of nature, planning, and inevitability conspiring to deliver a lesson years in the making. And as the neighbors watched, some stepping closer to gawk, others retreating to maintain distance, all recording and whispering, I reflected on the balance required to maintain maximum dramatic effect without causing irreversible damage, and how each liter of water, each redirecting wave, and each surge had been carefully calculated to ensure the message was unmistakable. Arrogance and overreach, especially when wielded through petty HOA tyranny, inevitably meet creative, precise, and unavoidable resistance. And as the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the street, reflecting off waterlogged furniture, floating debris, and puddles now spilling out toward the yard, I knew that the day's spectacle would become legend, a story recounted for years as a cautionary tale, while Karen, now exhausted, drenched, humiliated, and utterly defeated, finally slumped in resignation, unable to call for further assistance, the reality of her folly fully realized, and I, finally stepping back into my yard, boots caked with mud, clothes damp from earlier hose adjustments, surveyed the scene with quiet satisfaction, knowing that the lesson had been delivered in full. Authority misused, arrogance unchecked, and relentless harassment all met with a perfectly orchestrated response that balanced ingenuity, patience, and theatrical flair, leaving Karen and the neighborhood alike in awe, disbelief, and permanent recognition of the consequences that inevitably follow overreach. As the late afternoon sun began to dip lower, casting long, dramatic shadows across the neighborhood, Karen had descended into a level of panic that transcended mere frustration. Her oversized frame slumped and soaked, hair plastered to her round, red-streaked face, eyes wide and filled with disbelief, flailing arms occasionally knocking over floating lamps or sliding chairs, furniture tipped at precarious angles, and her cries had become a constant, high-pitched wail, alternating between frantic phone calls, incoherent complaints to imaginary authorities, and desperate muttering to herself, while the floodwaters she had attempted to resist now surged in controlled chaos through every room of her home, creeping into corners she had hoped would remain dry, carrying floating cushions, soaked papers, waterlogged electronics, and decorative items into increasingly absurd positions. And outside, the neighbors had fully congregated on their porches and lawns, phones raised, some whispering in stunned awe, others snickering quietly at the perfect orchestration of the chaos unfolding before them, their voices a chorus of amusement and disbelief, while I, standing outside in mud-caked boots, soaked from earlier adjustments yet still perfectly dry compared to her, watched with a mixture of satisfaction, pride, and the subtle thrill of seeing years of harassment, petty fines, and overbearing HOA authority come crashing down in a spectacle of poetic justice. And as Karen attempted to push a floating rug back under her coffee table, she slipped yet again, arms flailing, water splashing higher, cushions and lamps tilting dangerously, papers scattering across the room, and she realized fully for the first time that no amount of effort could stop the inevitable, that the water's flow was now entirely beyond her control, a testament to meticulous planning, patience, and strategy. And as the neighbors continued recording every moment, sharing whispers and laughter, I subtly adjusted a valve to redirect a small stream toward her stairwell, ensuring the water continued to cascade into previously untouched areas, sending more belongings afloat and amplifying her panic. While Karen's phone calls became increasingly desperate, shrill, and incoherent, the HOA office unable to provide assistance, friends and relatives arriving only to witness the spectacle, equally helpless against the perfectly orchestrated flood, and as she finally sank to the floor in sheer exhaustion, dripping wet, arms wrapped around a floating cushion, hair plastered, face streaked with water and sweat, her body slumping in a mixture of defeat, disbelief, and humiliation, I felt the perfect culmination of the day's efforts, the visual and emotional crescendo of years of pettiness, overreach, and intrusion, and as I walked slowly around the perimeter of my property, surveying the chaos, I allowed myself a moment to reflect on the precision of the execution. Every hose, every valve, every redirected flow of water designed to maximize dramatic effect while avoiding structural damage, each decision carefully calculated to ensure that Karen's realization of her folly was both absolute and undeniable, while the neighbors, murmuring, filming, and exchanging incredulous glances, captured the day in a way that would cement its story for years to come, a cautionary tale of arrogance undone by ingenuity, patience, and relentless determination. And as Karen's movements grew slower, less coordinated, sloshing through water that had now invaded every corner, entryway, hallway, and room she had once prided herself on keeping pristine, I knew the lesson had fully landed. Authority is meaningless when abused, petty fines and constant surveillance only invite creative, inevitable consequences, and sometimes the tools of patience, planning, and physics speak louder than words or complaints ever could. And as I finally stepped back into my yard, boots sinking slightly in mud, clothes damp from earlier hose adjustments, surveying the absolute completion of the flood's impact, water still pooling but stabilized, furniture partially submerged or tilted, electronics and decorations damaged, and Karen finally slumping fully in exhausted defeat, hair clinging to her round face streaked with water and sweat, I allowed myself a quiet, victorious smile, knowing that the spectacle of her meltdown, the chaos perfectly documented by neighbors, and the inevitable conversations that would follow in HOA circles, social media, and whispered recountings would serve as a permanent reminder that overreach, arrogance, and harassment invite consequences, that power wielded without respect is fragile, and that patience, strategy, and a willingness to take control of one's own property can turn even the most overbearing adversary into a cautionary tale. And as the sun dipped further, reflecting off waterlogged floors, floating cushions, scattered papers, and tipsy furniture, casting golden light across the drenched, defeated figure of Karen and the stunned, amused and slightly awestruck neighbors, I realized that the day's events had transformed the neighborhood dynamic irreversibly, establishing a new understanding of boundaries, respect, and consequence, leaving Karen humiliated, the HOA scrambling, and me standing outside, muddy boots, damp clothes, and a profound sense of justice fully realized, the flood not merely an act of revenge but a perfectly executed lesson, dramatic, theatrical, and undeniably effective, ensuring that for years to come, the story of how Karen's arrogance and relentless petty tyranny were undone by water, planning, and determination would be remembered, recounted, and whispered as one of the most satisfying acts of poetic justice imaginable in suburban history, a finale that left no doubt in anyone's mind that authority, when misused, inevitably meets creative and unflinching resistance, and that sometimes a flood is worth 1,000 warnings, every droplet a message, every splash a testament, and every shriek an exclamation point on the lesson long overdue.